Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this third edition of the Place to Crowd, organized by Financement Participatif France and MangoPay. I'm Anaëlle Toubiana. I'm managing institutional relations for FPF, Financement Participatif France. We are a professional association that brings together the platforms and the French crowdfunding ecosystem. We federate 140 members, among whom 68 crowdfunding platforms in donation, loan, investment, but also banks, law firms, electronic money providers, robo-advisor, investors, and so on. Since 2012, FPF has carried out lobbying actions to change the regulations relating to crowdfunding in collaboration with the public authorities and regulators in France. Promotional and educational actions, ethics and sharing of best practice. And finally, we facilitate the development of the ecosystem through pooled service offers, meetings, and networking. In partnership with MangoPay and with the inability to organize physical meetings in this time of health crisis, we have started a series of webinars. The first session was held on February, and if you're interested, you can find replays on the previous webinars on the FPF YouTube channel. Our topic today is one or more crowdfunding. As you know, the crowdfunding sector is subject to harmonization at a European level. Indeed, from November 10th, 2021, platforms that wish to continue providing crowdfunding service will have to obtain European approval as European crowdfunding service providers. This webinar is therefore an opportunity to have an overview of the crowdfunding market across Europe and to learn about the platform's feelings regarding the new status to come according to the regions. Now, I give the floor to Maike for a brief introduction of MangoPay, an explanation of the practical aspects of this conference, and last but not least, she will introduce to you our panel members. And if you have any question about FPF, I'm available on the chat during the meeting. I wish you all a good webinar, and thank you.
Thank you, Anaëlle. Welcome everybody to Place to Crowd today. My name is Maike Bas. I am Chief Marketing Officer at MangoPay, and I'm very happy to be here and to have this beautiful webinar about one or more crowdfunding in Europe today. First of all, a couple of technical things. We have a chat where you can chat. Feel free to also introduce who you are. It's always nice to see who we are sharing the webinar with today. Second, we have a questions part, so you can ask some questions on this site. And of course, at the end of the webinar, we'll also make sure that we have some time so that we can answer any questions that you want. During the webinar, we'll have maybe some polls coming up as well to keep it nice and interactive for everybody. So for the ones that don't know MangoPay, MangoPay is a payment solution for marketplaces and crowdfunding platforms. And we offer a white label technology that enables entrepreneurs and platforms to accept, escrow, and pay out their funds. And we have more than 2,500 platforms across Europe. And that's why we're also very happy to be here and to participate and listen to this beautiful webinar, because we do have a lot of different crowdfunding platforms in our portfolio and partners that we work with. So with us today for one or more crowdfunding in Europe, we have actually a panel of different people from different regions in Europe. And I would like to introduce you our first panel members. So we have from Estonia, Kirsti Pent, partner at TGS Baltic Estonian office and member of the Finance Estonia crowdfunding working group. She will join us very soon. From Spain, we have Ramon Saltor, CEO at Dozen Investment and representative of the crowdfunding vertical at the AEFI, Asociación Española de FinTech and InsurTech. Then we have from Germany, Carsten Wenslav, research affiliate in alternative finance, crowdfunding, blockchain, and FinTech regulation at the Bundesverband Crowdfunding. And last but not least, from France, we have Jérémie Benmoussa, President of Financement Participatif France, where we are doing the webinar with today. And I would like actually to start with you, Jérémie, and ask you a first question. For you, what does crowdfunding look like in the different countries, and especially in France? And do you see any differences between the countries?
Thank you, Meike. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here to present you the different phases of crowdfunding market, and especially on France. Regarding the French market, especially, I would say that the French market presents a huge diversity of lines of fundings. The French market is very dynamic today. Last year in 2020, the market reached for the first time the billion euro of collect, which had never happened before, and in spite of the COVID-19 crisis. The French market is structured around three main lines of funding. Of course, you have the donation market. Donation is the historical declination of the crowdfunding in France. Many people in France keep identifying crowdfunding to solidarity donation, even if today the mentalities are changing toward a more financial vision. Donation represents a very stable market that grew dramatically last year due to all the solidarity efforts that were led to support the work of medical and hospital staff and all the solidarity efforts. But what we can say on donation is that this is a very, very stable market in terms of collect, since last year donation represent more or less 100 million of collect every year in France. The second line of the second segment of the market is the loan market, which is today the main segment of crowdfunding in France. It represents more than 75% of the collect every year. And the loan market is dedicated to support the development of many projects on the economic sector, cultural sector, and social sector. We'll see that later, but we see on the loan market a strong preponderance of the bond market. The bond is a very interesting financial product for our investors. More than 90% of the loan market was represented by the bond product last year. And finally, the third market, which is the investment equity market, equity in crowdfunding, which we see today as a market with a little future for us. We'll see that later. Every year in France, it represents less than 5% of the total of the collect. So it's not the most dynamic market. You have, I think you have understood that. If we compare the France against the rest of Europe and the other markets, I would say that the French market is one of the most diversified markets of Europe in terms of economic sectors. All the economic sectors are funded by crowdfunding platforms today in France. It's great. Of course, you have some sectors who concentrate a part of the collect, but it's a global effort of economy to fund their projects by crowdfunding. You have also a huge diversification in terms of financial products, shares, bond, loan, donation, and so on. And finally, a huge diversity of project holder, companies companies raise funds, associations, local communities, and so on, which implies that France was in 2020 the second market on the continental Europe, behind Germany, in terms of collect, and France should grow dramatically in terms of collect for 2021. So the exit of the crisis is today. We'll go back later on this fact, but the exit of the exit from the COVID-19 crisis will allow the French market to continue its dramatic growth, which we saw the 5 last years.
Thank you. And Karsten, knowing that France is the second market, but just shared by Jérémie, Germany is the first market. How do you see the crowdfunding within Germany and in comparison to the other countries?
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. And also thanks so much to MangoPay and also to FPF for organizing these webinars. You know, for me, it's really great pleasure to work with FPF together, especially on the European crowdfunding service provider regime. We've been really actively collaborating, and it's great that we also see the not the first, but in a more emerging collaboration between platforms between France and Germany, co-finding platforms, mergers and acquisitions. So it's starting to feel more European, because in the past, I think all the markets were very much segmented. And you can see this in the data, for instance, by the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, but also of the European Commission. The only exception maybe are the Baltic platforms, and Kirsti can maybe say more about why this is the case, because the Baltic platforms were very early active in other countries as well. But for instance, German platforms, I think, focused mostly on their home market. French platforms focused mostly on their home markets. So, and the European crowdfunding service provider regime is going to put a lot of competition into the European space. Right now in Germany, the lending market, and we're talking only just peer-to-peer lending here, is about 800 million euros last year. The equity market is about 400 million euros. Our members in the crowdfunding station have about 80 to 85% of that market between themselves. But I do think that this is going to change dramatically in the future for 3 reasons, essentially. Number one, we see more and more institutional investors, especially in the lending area, but also in the equity area. For instance, one of the biggest changes in volumes is sometimes affected by how traditional finance banks, especially, are regulated. So sometimes the amount of projects on the platforms is determined by the co-funding from traditional banks. And so we can really see that this is going to be very important also in the future, where through the ECSP license, the platforms are going to cover all the retail-oriented investments, and then the co-funding are going to be with institutional investors. So that's the first one. The second one I would say is we also see much more public interaction with these crowdfunding platforms. So we do have several cities and Bundesländer, federal states in Germany, which have established platforms and which are working on that, and which have established credit guarantees and other forms of support to the platforms. So this is really happening, and it's also going to drive up the volume of crowdfunding in Germany. And the last thing I think is my impression, and this is our how we also perceive ourselves, is that crowdfunding is more and more the term crowdfunding is sometimes a little bit replaced by other terms, like, for instance, in Germany, a lot of platforms now use the term digital investing, impact investing, which means they actually are not just reaching out to the crowd, to the traditional crowd, the small investors, but to a more sophisticated audience. And I think the ECSP is also going to push this, because then you can combine sophisticated and non-sophisticated investors for greater financing rounds.
Very interesting. Thank you, Karsten. You mentioned the Baltic states. I would love to ask Kirsti to share on her side. How is it for the Baltic states or for Estonia in terms of the crowdfunding ecosystem? And yeah, feel free to share.
Yeah, hello. In terms of the Baltics, it's actually quite different from one country to another. For example, the Estonian regulator until now has taken an approach that there is no specific regulation for crowdfunding companies, so they're quite free to operate as long as they don't fall under MiFID or any other EU regulations already in place. So it has been thriving in Estonia. And Karsten mentioned Baltics. I guess one of the reasons for it was that actually the Estonian and other Baltic crowdfunding platforms, most of their investors are actually German. So yeah, we're thankful for that. What else? In Latvia, the situation recently changed because their largest platforms, they're not quite crowdfunding, I'd say peer-to-peer lending more. Mintos, Twino, and other large ones, they now become investment firms because that's what the approach that the regulator took. In Estonia, such platforms are not regulated. Many of them actually moved from Latvia to Estonia. But in Estonia, the main focus is still on real estate crowdfunding, and which probably will remain so in the future as well. But yeah, peer-to-peer lending and real estate crowdfunding are the most popular here. And of course, especially the real estate crowdfunding platforms are looking forward to the EU regulation to enter into force and to be able to passport and so forth. Equity crowdfunding is not that popular in Estonia. We do have a couple of platforms, but it's real estate crowdfunding is clearly more popular.
Thank you, Kirsti, and we'll definitely have some opportunity to talk about the European regulation that's coming. But before that, I also would love to hear from you, Ramon. How is the situation in Spain?
Yeah, hello, good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for inviting me. Well, I think that compared especially to Germany and France, where we are much smaller at this moment. I think last year they were invested through platforms around 200 million euros in Spain, and we could say that in part maybe our Spanish investors are more traditional and more focused or used to be more traditional and more focused in other traditional assets, but also the regulation that was approved here in Spain in 2015. I think that it wasn't a bad regulation. The problem is that the Spanish supervisor, the CNMV, the Spanish supervisor, did some interpretations that maybe did difficultate a little bit our work and how were we growing. However, here in Spain, I would say, I mean, the biggest crowdfunding is the rewards crowdfunding, but then both crowd lending, real estate, and crowd equity are growing more or less the same. And especially in crowd equity, I think that we're more focused here in Spain in co-investing with proper VCs investing in startups and all of this. So more like an investment vehicle that are co-investing with professional VCs.
And what would be the most financial tools, or which financial tools most used in Spain, Ramon?
Financial tools, both loans and equity. I mean, most of there are also things like convertible notes, are platforms studying about doing venture debt, things like this, but most of it is both lending and equity, investing in lending in equity. In case when using lending, it's for small companies, small and medium companies. For when it's used equity, normally it is investing in startups.
Okay, Very interesting. What does the rest see in their countries? Is that very different, or is there already things that we can compare in terms of the financial tools using your countries in comparison that Ramon just shared with us? Jérémie, you want to share maybe?
Yeah, in France, you know, as I said, the bond represent last year 2/3 of the collect of the market, and the bond is in fact bound to the real estate market. Real estate market, real estate crowdfunding in France consists in funding the equity necessary to real estate developers to build their assets. All the real estate crowdfunding platforms use the bond. All the investors invest through a bond issuance. And so the real estate market represented last year half of the collect on the crowdfunding market in France. You know, real estate is cultural in France. All the French people love real estate. Real estate is today the engine of the growth of the crowdfunding market. It has been the engine for 3 years right now. And it should continue in the coming years. So the bond is very preponderant on our market. The second product is standard loan and equity, which are very far from the bond, since equity plus loan you reach 100 million euros, which is 500 million behind the bond. So the market is very concentrated around this tool, in fact.
Thank you for that. Karsten, Kirsti, anything you want to add on that, or anything you notice from your countries?
I mean, in Germany, the lending platforms, they've been depending on their license, they've been using a standard loan setup or having to work closely together with a bank which originates the loans, and then the platform sells it to the investors. So the loan origination model, and I think that's also quite common in other countries. And on the equity side, not a lot of classical securities were used, and this is going to be quite interesting for the ECSP as well, because in Germany right now, a lot of the equity platforms are using subordinated loans, which are essentially loans structured like equity, and because that's the only or one of the few financial instruments which are being allowed in the crowdfunding exemption right now. But this will not be covered by the ECSP. So we're November 11, we are going to have some really interesting case where there's going to be a national crowdfunding exemptions for most of the German platforms, which they can continue to use. And then we have the ECSP, where the ECSP covers loans and transferable securities. So that's going to be quite interesting. And then one of the other things which I think is going to be still under debate is, for instance, how security tokens are being sort of regulated in the end. I mean, we do have regulation of security tokens. However, we personally think they would fall under the ECSP regulation as well, because they are structured as securities. But we have heard from some members of the governments that they are quite skeptical and don't want security tokens to be used as financial instruments as part of the European crowdfunding harmonization. So that's going to be interesting, how the regulator is going to decide about that.
Definitely. Thank you, Karsten. Go ahead, Kirsti.
Yeah, so in Estonia, the models that are being used by real estate crowdfunding platforms is clearly just direct loans from the investors to the project developers. Equity platforms use direct investments into shares, or I also think that what you could call security tokens. And then peer-to-peer lending is mainly claim assignment models, which Mintos and Fino, most well known, used to have. Now they're moving to different structures, but claim assignments are still very popular as well.
Okay, thank you. And knowing now a little bit of the ecosystem and also, or at least how the different countries what we have, how do you feel about the new EU regulation and implementation that is coming in November? I would love to hear all of you, specifically from your country perspective, but also how does it work when it's becoming more European? Maybe to start with you, Ramon.
So that I'm with the mute when I don't talk. Well, I mean, I'm really happy or expecting about how it will work. I mean, in the case of as a national market as Spain, I think it's going to be very good for us, for the platforms, as per what you said before, because of the 2015 regulation. Platforms were not able to create investment vehicles and syndicate investors, so it made it a little bit difficult for us. Also because a lot of times we had platforms from abroad searching here deals and offering creating investment vehicles that we couldn't because of the regulation. Now with the new European regulation, we will be able to. So I think it's going to be a good moment for both for the Spanish platforms, but also for the European market, as we needed an harmonization. I mean, we need to work as a proper market, as a unique market. Then it is going to be much bigger. I think that there's going to be, as you said before, a lot of collaborations between platforms from different countries in order to control part of the market. So I think it's going to be a really attractive period for the platforms, for the market, in that it will help us to grow a lot.
Great. And does the rest of the panel see it as well like that?
I mean, we've been following the ECSP for a long time now. I mean, I was part in the really early discussions at the European Commission when at that time the member states said they don't want to have a harmonized regime. They would rather have, like more standard setting type of regime where national regimes should exist. And then, the European Commission proposed an additional, at that time, 28th regime. And then the member states said, no, I think we want to have like a proper regime which is implemented by the national regulators. So I think it's going to be, I already see this as a standard setting for many other jurisdictions around the world. So we are in talks with regulators in Northern Africa, for instance, or in the Middle East, or in North America, which are trying to see which part of the European crowdfunding service provider regime can be also implemented in their countries. But it's a very, compared, for instance, if you compare it to the regime for lending in Kenya or in Indonesia, or for equity crowdfunding in Malaysia, it's a regime which will impose a lot of burdens to the platform as well. I think it's balanced in the sense that it allows, it gives some level of dealing with that in an easy way, but there's also some things in there which will especially make it difficult for small platforms to comply with all of these regulations. So I think what will happen in the first 3-4 years is, of course, a huge amount of new platforms on the market, but I do think that in the end, the large platforms are simply going to scale up and sort of take over the competition. And then it's going to be interesting how, in which markets they will position themselves first. So we do see a lot of interest in Germany, for instance. Estate Guru has an office in Berlin. October from France has an office in Munich. Cedars and other platforms from outside are present in Germany. But at the same time, it's still just like really early stage. And And that's I think going to be determined then how quick the regulators can implement the ECSP. As you know, the deadline for the ECSP when it's going to be enforced is November 10th. And when we look around the European Union, a lot of countries have not even finished their implementation laws. A lot of countries are still in the process of finding out how the licensing actually is going to work. They haven't set out how much the fees are. So, given the fact that we are 2 months before the harmonization of the European crowdfunding law, it's, I think, a little bit, we could be much further in this road, to be honest.
Okay, thank you, Karsten. Go ahead, Jérémie.
Yeah, I think like Karsten that the French actors today adopt a very careful and balanced position. The members of FPF have very recently understood that they will have to comply with a new regulation, a European regulation, that will expose them to a more severe regime than the existing one in France. In France, you have two main regimes, IFP, intermédiaire en financement participatif for the lending platforms, and CIP, conseiller en investissement participatif, for the equity platforms. They will pass to a world where there's only one text, which will expose them to more control and more regulation. And on the contrary, even if the European market will represent a new international outlet for all the French actors, historically the French actors remained in France because the French market is large, because they found enough outlets nationally to grow. Karsten, you talked about October, but October is today the only French platform that expanded internationally. All the other French platforms have kept 99% of their activity in France. That's a fact. Mainly because you have many real estate crowdfunding platforms. I already talked about it. And mainly because you also have a kind of cultural, you have a how to put it, a cultural footprint of French platform in France. I would add something regarding the funding of the platforms in France, which is important. Until 2015, some VC funds invested on the crowdfunding platforms. You had some platforms like Uniland, Smart Angels, who raised some funds from VC funds to grow and probably go abroad. All those investments were not profitable for these funds. And so since 2015, you haven't had some huge fundraising on the French crowdfunding market. So excepted October, you don't have in France an actor that has raised enough money to go abroad. That's also a fact. So we are waiting for what will happen. We are enthusiastic because we will expand the possibility to propose to our investors some projects that sit located abroad. But we are expecting the arrival of this new regulation. We are expecting how foreign platforms will come to France. We are waiting for what will happen.
Okay, very clear. Kirsti, how does that feel from your side for Estonian platforms?
Well, the ones that are covered by the ECSB are, of course, welcoming it, because of the opportunity to operate abroad. A bit concerned about the national specifics that may be implemented, but still, they are very much welcoming it, and they also like it because they since, as I mentioned, we didn't have any specific crowdfunding regulation until now, and the bigger market players are actually happy that there will be some unified requirements and licensing and supervision, because it means that the sort of less dodgy platforms operating. So yeah, there is generally it's a positive, seen as a positive thing. However, the Estonian government had the plan to also introduce an additional law which would capture all the other types of platforms. In addition, those which would not be covered by the CSP, but everything else, basically applying the same requirements as the EU regulation. Currently, it has been postponed, and just recently the draft law to implement the regulation was introduced. So it seems that at the moment Estonia is going for minimum, the bare minimum that is required under the regulation that for national implementation, that will be done, and that's it. So no additional requirements, or also basically none of the options being used. But at least now we know what the fees will be, what the licensing fee would be. So at least we have that much clarity. It hasn't been adopted yet, but at least we have the draft.
Yeah, I'm sorry if you let me add something on what we all said, that maybe I look too much optimistic when saying that we are really happy and well, waiting for what's going to happen. I mean, at the end, it's what all they said. We're now in a moment that, I mean, there are going to be some things interesting, but I said it's not only Spain, but in all the countries that we are all expecting on how they really implement it and how is it going to be the first 12 months. Let's see, all the countries have to do some adaptation sometimes, others will do less. And let's see how does the European passport work, because at the end, I'm not sure if it is gonna be as easy as asking your supervisor that you want to go to another country, and just in, I think it's 1 month, something like this, they have to let you start working in this new country. We will see. I mean, but it's at least it's interesting to see what's gonna happen in the next 12 months.
I think, a consensus that everybody's very excited, have some questions as well, and is still waiting on exactly how it's going to be in reality. Do you think that, I mean, harmonizing this regulation and having this EU kind of label almost is setting a precedent for other regions or for other continents? I heard you, Karsten, saying very quickly about also talking with other countries outside of Europe about it. What do you feel, is this something that we can also use as a EU label from our side?
I mean, maybe just we just recently published a report by the European Commission, which was trying to set or to propose ways how a public authority, like a region or a city or a public bank or a bank owned by a municipality or by a region, how they can collaborate with crowdfunding platforms. And we did interviews with many of these stakeholders, and they said the ECSP is going to provide some clarity here, because the ECSP is going to be like a label of quality, because the level of compliance is quite high. So it has to be quite high in order to operate under the ECSP regime. So I think that's definitely going to be used. And you know, the European Parliament had one option, and it was proposed by a British member of the European Parliament. He said that if countries outside of the European Union sort of copy the European crowdfunding regulation, one-to-one, then they can also operate in the European Union. And the idea, of course, was to give the British platforms a way of entering the European market after Brexit. And so that was rejected because the European Parliament didn't want to do this, but we already see from outside ways how that connects. My colleague Andrew from the Crowdfunding Insider is also part of the audience. He can talk about this much more, but it was quite interesting how when in the European crowdfunding regulation, the threshold for these investments were set at 5 million euros. There was a lot of debate also in the United States to move the crowdfunding exemption from, I think, 1.3 million US dollars to $5 million US for retail investors. So I do think there's a lot of, how regulators look at each other and try to see what are the appropriate thresholds for these retail-facing investors. So I already see this happening, and it's going to be much more stronger. And also this is especially relevant for MangoPay. One of the issues which regulators around the world face is how to, who's supposed to do all these AML checks, KYC? Is this the payment service provider? Can platforms provide these payment services, or do they have to have a special regulatory status? And the ECSP has made this choice that the platform cannot, needs to have a separate license in order to provide the payments or work with someone together like MangoPay in order to comply here. And I think this is also being copied by a lot of regulators around the world, where they say there has to be a difference between the platform, which intermediates the investments or the loans, and those who are providing additional services to the platforms like payment services.
Thank you, Karsten. And thanks for the MangoPay mention, always welcome. Knowing that, I also want to ask, so maybe actually I saw that there was a question on Paul. Karsten, you already answered it, but I also would like to ask it to the rest of the panel. According to you, is revenue-based financing or royalties-based financing covered by the ECSP regulation? If not, how is it covered under your respective jurisdiction? Anybody that maybe wants to answer that one?
I mean, I think in Spain, the way that it works now, it wouldn't be through this inside this regulation considered as crowdfunding. I mean, at least in Spain, the platforms that are doing revenue-based loans and all the stuff is with funds that they have or VCs that are investing in them in a vehicle that will fund all the startups, the companies they are funding. So from my point of view, at least in the way that it's working in Spain, it wouldn't.
Jérémie, how is it for? Yes, go ahead.
As far as I'm concerned, the royalties will not be part of the ECSP regulation. We are working a lot on this topic with Anaël from FPF, with the French National Authority Control, AMF, Autorité des marchés financiers, from our last discussion with the regulator, royalties may not be covered by the next ECSP. In France, historically, royalties were integrated in the lending agreement status, IFP, intermédiaire en financement participatif. You have more and more platforms that propose to the investors some royalties from various projects. I don't know if the only question remaining regarding royalties in France is that will platforms that will propose royalties project from projects specifically located in France will be able to propose these royalties to their investors? Will it be covered by a French regulation status? I don't know. At our latest discussion showed that royalties may be excluded from the platform, which is, of course, which is which is sad for all those platforms. But it has to be confirmed, and maybe Florence Demopoux, who lead with me FPF, could add some insight on the topic.
Thank you, Jeremy. Kirsti, do you have anything to add from your side on that?
Well, only in terms of national law. So, yeah, as I mentioned, currently we have none specific regulation, but we will have to see. As I mentioned, there are plans to introduce additional regulations to cover all different types of crowdfunding. So we'll see in the future.
Thank you. I have a question from Florence. Are lending and investment platforms subject to fight against money laundering and terrorist financing currently in your countries? Karsten, you want to maybe start?
Yeah. In Germany, the fintechs are subject to AML requirements, but they are regulated on the regional level. So that's why sometimes, you know, the laws are the same, but the way they are implemented and by the regional levels is quite difficult. We had this issue. I mean, this is obviously not a crowdfunding platform, but Wirecard. Well, no, I'm not going to say anything about Wirecard. But anyway, so you know, in general, the lending platforms and investment platforms have to do AML checks, have to do KYC, have to do like, you know, have to ensure this, but they work closely together with the payment service providers, which are covering a lot of these duties. There are additional things which the platforms have to do, but I think, at least in Germany, as far as I know, that's more the main work has to be done here by the payment service providers. What is sometimes a little bit difficult is that you know, like, I mean, we can talk openly about this. It's unclear from the implementation when platforms have to check against AML, for instance. So there are platforms which check very early on when onboarding new customers and especially investors. That's when they make sure they, you know, identify these then. But some other platforms, you know, like wait a little bit until someone has invested several times. And so that's a little bit of difference. But with the ECSP, it's more clearer because that's where, you know, the procedures are quite clear how AML and KYC have to be done by the platforms. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody has anything to add on that one?
Yeah, for example, in Estonia, the platforms are not required under law to do AML checks. However, they do it in practice because otherwise no bank would open an account for them. So in practice, they do follow them.
Thank you, Kirsti. We do have a couple of more questions that are coming in. I do want to first have another question for you because still on the advantages, the disadvantages of the new regulation. I did hear a lot of positivity from all your sides, and I do want to ask you if you do see it as really a true opportunity for players on the market to really capture new market as well, and if so, how do you foresee that going into the next couple of years? Open for all.
I think that somebody said it at the beginning. I mean, I think that more that capturing new, well, I mean, of course, there will be platforms capturing new markets, opening new markets, also platforms from abroad entering in Europe as it is going to be bigger. But I think that we will see more integration between platforms from different countries that want to take the whole area all together. I think it's more or less going to go this way.
Very clear, thank you. Jeremy, anything to add on that?
I think in the coming years, we should take advantage from this European regulation to build a global crowdfunding actor, like the Chinese, like the Americans, we should take advantage from a 400 million investor market to build a global actor. I think that if each one stays home, we will not be able to do this. But by combining our means and our markets, we have the opportunity to build strong competitors against Chinese and Americans, which have taken a substantial advance before us. So I think in 2-3 years we will build a fundrise, for example, a European fundrise for real estate, for instance. Even if all the real estate European markets are very different, each country has a very specific real estate market, but the combination of means and all the markets should lead us to build a fundrise, for instance, or one of those mega platform like we can see in the US.
And to have that happen, do you feel already that there's a change happening in terms of the European platforms and associations talking more together in comparison maybe to 1-2 years ago?
No, I think it's one of our main challenges. When I took the presidents of FPF 2 years ago, it was one of my priority to open new discussions with our colleagues in Italy, in Spain, Germany, and so on. And 2 years later, we haven't done enough. So, yeah, Karsten.
No, I think so. So, for instance, I mean, with Finance Estonia and also with FPF and so on, we worked really closely last summer, and we noticed that this really worked off. For instance, there was an issue which was raised by by FPF, which was related to the lending, to the default rate disclosure, and I think the FPF already has some really good standards, and the issue was whether these standards, can be continued or whether they should be replaced by the new standards prescribed by the ECSP. And we as German crowdfunding association, we supported the position of FPF, even though we don't have any standards yet on default disclosure. We have investor reporting standards, but not as specific as the FPF has. So I think this has started, this is an example of where collaboration has started. Mm-hmm. What I would like to see much more is interactions between platforms. So especially, for instance, where there's a good test case would be by all those platforms which are active in Africa, doing climate investments. There I can see a lot of support where we can do cross-country crowdfunding campaigns, because the platforms themselves, I think they are very much eager to share, and there's a lot of investments there which can be done. These are transnational investments or lendings anyway. So we already have the first collaborations. I think there's a couple of platforms from France which also collaborate with the German energy platforms. So it's good, it's starting, but I would like to see much more. And my thinking, Jérémie, is that we have to probably facilitate more like more personal interaction between the platforms, because in the end it comes down to trust, to be able to sort of be able to negotiate with themselves. So I think maybe that's something we definitely can do more in the future.
I think we have to make some progress collectively. Yeah. And the development of this kind of webinar is especially here to develop our cooperation partnership. So we should organize many more webinars right now.
Great. And so maybe more for Kirsti and Ramon, in addition to having platforms, having the associations, also, talking more, having more webinars, do you see any room for new partners coming up? Anything that can help the industry even further? Ramon or Kirsti, you want to go?
Yeah, okay, I can start. Do you mean the sort of the infrastructure to support crowdfunding platforms?
Exactly.
Well, I think in Estonia, the main thing that the sort of the supporting infrastructure are the different companies which provide identification and other KYC AML services. So we have those in place, but other than that, I'm not sure if there I would see anything else coming up or yeah.
Okay, thank you. Ramon, anything to add?
I don't know. I'm sure that there will be better partners thinking, for example, in our case or in the Spanish platform's case. There are so many things that partners could bring and do it better, but I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure, but I wouldn't be able to say in which area. But yeah, for sure, definitely.
Thank you. We do have also some questions that I would like to ask. So we have from Matthew, I am assuming that bonds are allowed instruments within the ESCP. Is this correct? Who would like to take this one? Jérémie, I see you nodding.
Yeah, for sure, bonds are allowed. As I said, if you disallow bonds, you will almost cancel the French market. So bonds will be allowed. The main form of bonds which are issued in France are zero coupon bonds, and in the text, this product will for sure will be allowed from a European perspective. Yeah.
Okay, anything to add from anybody?
I mean, on the second question regarding the simple bulletin board, which Matthew asked, I mean, this was a heavy discussion in the European Parliament, the European Commission, whether to allow secondary markets, and we see from platforms, like Our Crowd and also Cedars and Crowdcube, how powerful secondary markets can be for equity crowd investing, but also I think this is going to be, for some lending platforms, this might also be appropriate. But the European Union at that time, or European Commission, they said they don't want to have regulatory arbitrage. They don't want to have security exchanges, share exchanges, etc., moving into the ECSP regulation. And that's why they only put this simple bulletin board. But the ECSP is going to be, there has to be an evaluation in 2 years after implementation. And then they have to, for instance, look at whether the platforms should be allowed to operate secondary markets on their platforms. And I think that's really relevant, because I think a lot of retail investors right now, they don't, even in the lending platforms, they would use these secondary markets to, or these secondary markets would bring much more liquidity to the platforms than right now. And so I think the ECSP should change and allow secondary markets on the platforms.
And I hope that they do it fast, Carsten, because from a point of view, I completely agree. I think that this is one of the negative points in the European regulation. I mean, I think it was. I mean, we all know in all the countries that for private investing in companies such as startups or small companies, the liquidity is a big problem. Is one of the things that make you think twice whether to invest or not in those kind of assets. So having a secondary market would have been perfect. I mean, I think it's I was not in the conversations with the European Commission and all this stuff, but I mean, it's sad that it would have been a really good opportunity to study it for the last 2 years, 3 years, and decide how to do it, but let the platforms implement it. But we will see. We will see if in 2 years we are able to do it. For sure, it would be perfect for investors, I think.
Thank you. There's another question from Martin. I saw, Karsten, you already answered for Germany, but maybe for Kirsti and also for Ramon. Is the new ECSP status compulsory to all platforms in your country? Or is there another national status enabling crowdfunding activities without the ECSP?
So no national alternative in Estonia.
Same in Spain. I mean, we had this 2015 regulation that is going to be cancelled once the new European regulation is implemented. They are in Spain. They are developing now a quite a small regulation just to adapt some of the points or see how are we gonna adapt to some of the points of the European regulation. But it's going to be compulsory for all the platforms.
Yeah, it's the same in France. It will be compulsory for the platforms.
Great.
What is interesting in the ECSP regulation is it doesn't depend on how much you raise, but how much you offer. So, for instance, if you offer 5,000,001 euro on a platform for a project, then you are outside of the scope of the ECSP, even though if you're just raising, in the end, you're just raising 2.5 million. So then this is, for instance, in Germany, the crowdfunding exemption for securities is between 1 million and 8 million euros, and then you have to don't release a prospectus regime. So this is it's going to be quite interesting to see if people find the ECSP more attractive than the old prospectus regime. In some countries, of course, the exemptions are lower, but in it's quite easy to get out of the ECSP regime by simply putting the offering higher than 5 million euros. The European Commission, I'm not sure if they like it or if this was the intention, but this is how the law is written, and so it's going to be we said to the European Commission it would be the ECSP is still going to compete with the prospectus billing. Yeah, I know Florence said, and that's the problem. The German regulators and the European Commission and the French regulators, they're sometimes not in agreement, and we have to deal with that. And Florence and I have got headaches because we have to see who's right in the end.
I see indeed Florence saying it's not what the French regulator said. Make your regulators speak with the French ones. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for everything. I don't see that we have other questions. So if anybody here has any other question you would like to ask to anybody on our panel, feel free to do so right now, either on the chat or on the questions. In the meantime, I would like to ask everybody to just give a last word on where you think it's going, and your basically any tips that you want to give for any of our listeners. Should we start with you, Jérémie?
Excuse me, my connection cut. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Just a last word from everybody about the subjects that we just discussed today, to see if we have any questions left. But I would love to hear everybody's last little words for it.
As I said, we are excited by the future, by the new European regulation that will open new outlets for all the actors. I insist on a point to increase the collaboration between all the national associations. We will organize, FPF is working to organize next year European event in Paris to make Paris the center of European crowdfunding. So we are working closely with Florence and Anel to the organization of this event. We expect a lot from this event and a lot from Europe. So now let's focus on 2022.
Thank you, Jérémie. Kirsti.
Yeah, I mean, of course, excited for the opportunity to passport. But I think that being a lawyer, I'm also a bit concerned for the crowdfunding platforms, as I would anticipate that as with all other financial regulations coming from the EU, they end up getting more and more stringent. So that's maybe that's what I'm a bit worried and cautious about. That hopefully it won't end up being MiFID too at some point, which means that it's over-regulated and will basically give a way to platforms having to find new ways to sort of operate. So I hope that it stays reasonable.
Thank you, Kirsti. Hopefully next year at the event of FPF, we can see if that's the case or not. Ramon, you want to share anything?
More or less the same as both of them. I mean, I think that here in Spain we're very excited, especially because in some areas in which the Spanish regulation was not clear enough, the Spanish supervisor did some interpretations that were not positive for the sector. So in the European regulation, those matters are more clear. So I mean, it's always good to work with some more clarity. Regarding what Kirsti said, well, at the end, I think that since 2015 here in Spain, we have quite a lot of regulation in crowdfunding platforms. The European one doesn't make a big change in regarding controls to the platform. So, I mean, well, excited and waiting to see what happens the next 12 months. And I think that we know only a 5%, or we can imagine only a 5% of what will happen in the next 12 months.
Thank you, Ramon. Karsten, anything from your side you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also really excited about the ECSP, although, I mean, there is still some, blocks which have to be resolved. But in the end, I think, this is a work in progress. I think the politicians, both on the national and European level, they want this to work, and they want to see that it's a successful European project as part of the European Capital Market Union. So even though there's maybe something which are still unclear, I think in the end, also in Germany, we have some issues which we still need to solve, but with the regulator. But in the end, I think it's going to be quite a good instrument for them. But I share Kirsti's sort of fear that sometimes the regulators because they don't know the space very much, or no, they get to know it much more. They tend to overregulate some parts of it. And for this, what I would suggest is we definitely have to work more on like self-regulation across the European association. So maybe, Jérémie, for the event in France, this is something where we could discuss, because FPF was really a pioneer in providing industry standards coming from the platforms. So the platforms were, making a lot of really good suggestions, and then we looked at it and saw that was really good. So maybe this is something where we can see how we can make sure that this market functions well in those areas which are not regulated and which are then more practical than maybe having the regulator do this. And then, and I can say, what my members in the German Crowdfunding Association say they want very much is more collaboration between platforms, especially, like one or two or three platforms co-funding projects. And I think this is something which I would like to see more. And if there's anyone who would like to work with a German platform, more than happy to, set up the links and make sure that people get to know each other.
Thank you, Karsten. I think that's a great way to end the webinar of today. And I want to thank all of you, Ramon, Karsten, Jérémie, and Kirsti, for being panel members today, answering all the questions and giving your insight. I think it was very interesting. So thanks a lot for that. How can people connect with you after? LinkedIn? What is your preferred way of working?
LinkedIn, maybe I would say. It's the easiest.
Pearl? Okay, so feel free to connect with our panel members on LinkedIn if you even want to discuss it further. Our webinar recording will be shared with everybody, so you can also look it back. Two last little words we have. There is a next Place to Crowds webinar in November, the 18th of November, about new identification legislation and 3DS2. For anybody that wants to join. And of course, the exciting announcement of Jérémie for the event of FPF next year. So we're exciting to hear more about that as well, and continue the collaboration and the discussions, and together with the different European platforms, but also with the different European associations. So again, thanks everybody for being here, for your participation, and hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thanks for the
Thank you.
invitation.